Alright everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time we left off with the emergence of American nationality, talking about the real emergence of the people of America, rather than just the colonists from the country, the mother country kind of thing. Their own identity, you could say. But we're now on to the rebellious daughters. Originally, there had been in America three types of colonies: those planted by chartered company, as in Virginia and Massachusetts; those with individual proprietors, as in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Georgia; and the royal, as in New York. But eventually, they tended to the same pattern. The rights of chartered companies and of individual proprietors yielded to the claims of the crown. The general system consisted of a governor appointed by Britain and two house legislature, of which the lower one was elected by the voters of the colony, the upper house being appointed. Although there was usually a property qualification for the suffrage, it was easier to become a landowner in any of the 13 colonies than it was in Great Britain. And so the colonists, in certain respects, really enjoyed a greater degree of popular self-government than the majority of English, Scottish, or Irish. But there is always a possibility of friction between an executive chosen in one fashion and a legislature chosen in another. Although the colonies had representative government, they did not, like the British dominions today, enjoy responsible government. Dissension between royal governors and popular legislature was more the rule than the exception. Moreover, the governors were not selected for their knowledge of American conditions or their sympathy with the Americans. They represented family favor or expediency in British policy, or politics. In three specific areas, conflict between the colonist and the mother country was most acute: commerce, taxation, and the settlement of western lands. The British generally regarded the colonies as plantations established in the interest of British commerce, governing, as Arthur Young put it, great nations on the maxims of the counter. In theory, the colonists recognized the right of the British government to regulate foreign trade, but the manner in which this was done irked them extremely. They especially resented not being able to trade directly with the French, Spanish, and Dutch colonies in the West Indies. Hence, there was a good deal of smuggling. In Europe, as well as in America, smuggling was common. Boats of light draft could easily find harbor, and popular opinion was more often with the smuggler, who made goods cheaper than with the law enforcement officers. The matter of taxation was more serious. The French and Indian War had been expensive, and British opinion was that the colonists should bear their share of the expense, since they had reaped so much advantage from the removal uh, of the French from their neighborhood. But how the revenue from uh, but how to extract revenue from the penny-pinching colonist legislature? The first device was the Stamp Act. This was not a postage matter. It was the imposition of an official stamp duty on legal papers. It encountered general resistance. The Stamp Act was withdrawn, but the government laid special duties on a variety of commodities, which could be represented as merely commercial regulation, although their purpose was to raise revenue. Many of these duties were dropped, but a duty on tea remained, partly to aid the East India Company, and partly to maintain the right of the British Parliament to tax the colonies. The British theory was that the authority of Parliament was coextensive with the empire. To be sure, the colonists had no representation in Parliament, but they were virtually represented by the House of Commons. The Americans held that their colonial legislature had the sole right to levy taxes, which theory was the sounder in law was debatable. Um, oh boy. This is okay, but the American view was closer to the realities of the situation. Uh, to contend that a man in New York was represented by a voter in Yorkshire merely because both were commoners and British subjects was stretching abstract theory to the breaking point. After acquiring French Canada, the British government, by the Quebec Act of 1774, extended the frontier as far as the Ohio River, thus canceling the charter claims of several colonies, notably Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. This act left the French their civil law, but provided no representation for the people. With regard to the French, it was a wise measure. The people of Quebec were attached to their language and their Roman Catholic Church. They had never enjoyed representative government, and the British criminal law, now introduced, was milder than the French, but it also meant that an English settler beyond the mountains would find himself unrepresented and in a province dominated by the French language and the Roman faith. In none of these measures did the British government intend injustice or tyranny. The right to regulate trade was traditional. The tax devices were mainly to cover the expenses of the recent war with France, and the restrictions on Western settlement were partly to consolidate the people of Quebec and partly to avoid wars with the Indian tribes. The whole trouble was that measures which seemed just and reasonable in London might look different to a Virginian planter, a Boston merchant, or a frontier farmer in western Pennsylvania. Some of the better informed British statesmen pointed this out to Parliament, among them William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, Edmund Burke, the Irish orator, and Charles Fox, the Liberal Whig leader. But King George III was an obstinate man. Lord North and his ministry followed the royal lead, and the majority of the members of Parliament knew little and cared less about colonial opinion. As is often the case, war broke out over a minor incident. Resentful of the tea duty, a party of patriots disguised as Indians dumped a load of tea into the Boston harbor. The British government responded with severe punishment. They temporarily closed the port of Boston, suspended the charter of Massachusetts, authorized the quartering troops in private homes, and provided that military offenses against civilians should be treated outside the colony. These intolerable acts, as the Patriots called them, provoked the first armed resistance. You can see there's a lot of pictures leading up to this. But now we're going to get into some of these pictures. A lot, so it's going to take me a little bit. But I'll talk about a little bit what they talked about here. This is actually a really good breakdown. As an American, I am kind of surprised that they talked about it in this way, because this is a book written in America, and it was only in the 80s, so it was a little bit of a different time. Nowadays, this is something that I think would be talked about a little bit more often, but back then, not as much. So it's really good that they're talking about this, because they are right. A lot of what the British were doing were within their rights, and they would have seemed just to them, because, I mean, they weren't wrong. However, like they brought up as well, a lot of the people in the colony would have seen it as very grating on them, because how is it fair to us that you can make laws for the people there and we have no say in those laws? Like it mentioned, a person in Yorkshire um, would decide the laws of a colonist, but they don't live in America. They don't live in the Americas. They don't live in the colonies. So how would they know what is best for the colonies? They're just going to do what's best for them, as they should, of course. But how is that fair? And how are people going to accept that? These were English that just moved to the colonies. So now they don't have rights because they are somewhere else. It seems a little unfair when you put it that way. And a lot of the colonies, it really is. It's these small things. If they had been done different ways, for instance, if the British government had said, hey, to the local governments, hey, we would like to raise some funds for paying back the war. It was a lot of money, and we need some. And they went about it a different way. Things could have maybe been different. And realistically, they could have. Even when the war broke out, a lot of Americans did not want to have independence. What they really wanted was to be heard by the king. But because, like they said, King George III was a little bit of an obstinate man, he very much worked hard against this. And then Parliament, in turn, also did as well. And it was an inevitability then that it would lead to a war for independence, rather than just, hey, we want to be heard. But now we'll talk about a lot of these pictures here. So this picture here is the Americans protested the Stamp Act, and the people of Boston, and people in Boston even, went so far as to burn the papers that had been sent from England in 1764. Yeah, you have a lot of these shows of, hey, we're not going to follow this, like we're going to revolt. And Boston especially is kind of the hotbed for a lot of these issues. Um, a lot of these people in Boston are very opinionated on this, and to be fair, they are right in their opinions on this. They should feel. Now, they maybe went a little too far at times, of course, but they are righteously angry, you could say. Um, and here is King George III of England, the monarch at the time of the American Revolution. King George III, first to speak English of his line, he's German, because by descent, his father was Georg, King Georg. His grandfather, King George I, Georg I, speaks German, but he speaks English. Um, Sad thing for him or his family, really, actually, he suffers from a little bit of insanity in his later life. He kind of loses himself somewhat. A very unfortunate way to go. Even if you don't necessarily like the guy, still an unfortunate way to go. At the top here, the Boston Tea Party was the event in which Americans dressed as Indians threw the cargoes of the English tea ships into Boston Harbor on the 16th of December, 1773. I almost said 33. 1773, though. Yeah, we don't really think about it, but there was a lot of money here. Because how this was stacked back then is these tea cakes. So what a tea cake is, if you've never seen one, it is a flat block of tea, and it's got multiple little like squares of tea. And each square you would cut off, and then you would add that, and that'd be part of your tea. And it kind of worked like that. Um, so all these crates are stacked with these blocks of tea, and so it's just hundreds and hundreds of pounds of tea, and it's so much money is thrown into that harbor. You really understand why they cracked down hard on this. There's a lot of money to just be thrown away. And above here is the Boston Massacre. On March 5th, 1770, a jeering crowd of men and boys were teasing a British sentry. He was joined by 7 soldiers and their commander. The jeering continued, and the soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 3 and mortally wounding 2 others. And a little bit more about that. They say jeering here. It's a little bit more than just that. There was a lot of, at first, name calling and yelling. Like they said, it was just one guy at first, and then more showed up. But eventually, the colonists start throwing things at them. First, it's snowballs, then it's oyster shells, and it's rocks. So it's already escalating. The colonists are kind of escalating it quite a bit. At some point, one of the soldiers hears fire. We're not sure by who, but they said they heard it from behind them. that someone yelled fire, and it's very possible that they did. And thinking it was their officer, they opened fire, killing, like they said, killing 3 and mortally wounding 2 others. Um, Interestingly enough, it's not talked about really as much, and this picture is not necessarily the best showing of it. But one of the men there was actually a black man who was in the crowd as well, also as part of this. Um, just interesting, to say the least. All right. At the opposite top here, Minutemen being summoned from their homes to fight. Men such as these fought the British in the battles of Lexington and Concord on April the 19th, 1775. Yeah, these Minutemen, so-called Minutemen, because they were to be ready at a minute's notice. That's kind of the idea. Your militiamen, and when you have stuff like this already getting set up by the colonists, you know it's already going downhill. When they're starting to stock arms and supplies, and the idea of the Minutemen is not just for the British. It was also in case like an Indian attack or something like that. Of course, it's for defense. But yeah, these Minutemen get ready, and like they say, the Battle of Lexington Concord, where this whole thing kind of kicks off, really. And then here is British troops march through the town of Concord prior to the battle, while Colonel Francis Smith and Major John Pitcairn uh, reconnoiter the area. They recon. I'm just gonna say recon. It's easier that way. Recon the area from the cemetery. Yeah, you can see this drawing here. British troops marching through Concord. I don't know how they ever thought this was going to turn out good. Like, I just can't. This has all the markings of this going horribly wrong. At the bottom left here, British troops marching back from Lexington to their headquarters in Boston and being harassed by expert snipers of the Minutemen. Yeah, so the British get beat in the battles of Concord and Lexington. Um, Pretty badly actually by the colonists, and so they have to retreat. And as they're going back, the whole time, more and more people have heard what has been going on in Lexington and Concord, and so try to join the fight and join in the area. And as they're showing up, they just keep showing up on the British's trail, heading back to Boston. These British troops are trying to flee, basically, and people from the woods keep popping up and just firing at them, firing at them, and they can't really fight back because they can't see them. A lot of these people, they know the colonists know this land better than these troops do, and so they're getting just harassed by these troops or by these Minutemen, and it's just devastating. Really, it really is. So above here is John Trumbull's painted "The Battle of Bunker Hill." On the 17th of June, 1775, the British were sent to occupy Breed's Hill to prevent the Americans from using it as a site for their cannons to bombard Boston, which was occupied by the British. The battle was has mistakenly been named after nearby Bunker Hill. Yeah, that's very true. Once again, I'm surprised by this book. I know it's only the 80s. I know it's the 80s, so it's not that long ago, but this is something that has been very much misnamed. Even back then, it was the Battle of Breed's Hill that got renamed to the Battle of Bunker Hill. And I will say Bunker Hill sounds a little better than Breed's Hill, if we're just going to be honest here. At the right here is another view of that battle. So you can see there's Charlestown. It's being burned. You got a lot of these British ships and things like that in the harbor. Yeah, and this battle of Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, uh, crazy, crazy battle. Some of the stories about the American Revolution, especially the early battles, some of the stuff that goes on, very, very crazy. And then here is a big overleaf, and it's the raising of the American flag in 1776. More specifically, the raising of the Liberty Pole, not the flag, my bad, the Liberty Pole. It's a very big, obviously important time. And look at this art. I really have to say, this art is quite amazing. You can really see a lot of the details in people's faces and how people would have reacted. And some of this stuff is just, it's so hard to even imagine what it would have been like back then and how people would have felt in these moments. That their actions would shape the course of history. But with that bit of a longer video, that's going to do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you have any ways to improve these videos, leave a comment down below. I always appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.